Now I'm in a farm in the fertile Cumber area. Lovely fields, rolling hills behind us here. As you can see, there's a field of spuds, I think, has been over the hedge here. And the reason we're here is to see a man working, laying farm hedges. Davy Thompson, he lives outside Ballywalter at the present, and Davy's going to give us a little talk and demonstration on how you lay a hedge. And it's such an integral part of farming, the hedges and stock proofing, and it's kind of not a forgotten art, but it's rare, put it that way. So let's go and see Davy here.
Well, I'm David Thompson. I'm a hedge layer. I live between Greyabba and Ballywalter. I've been a hedge layer for quite a while, probably seriously at it for 20 odd years. I worked at it with my father when I was younger. Didn't particularly like it then. It's my job to red up the bushes and maybe burn the bushes, and the fires used to get me all hot and bothered, and I didn't really like it, but stuck at it. And as time has gone by, I've gradually become more and more sort of keen on it. My father actually learnt hedge laying when he worked on farms in Herefordshire in England at the time, and that's where I got it from, and I'm very glad I did. Of all the different things I do, I would say the hedge laying is the one thing I would go to nearly the quickest. I get more satisfaction out of it. It's something that you can see as you progress. It goes on, you're doing a good job, and it's something that will be there for many years after you've gone away and left it, and you can drive up a road 10 years later and see a hedge that you've laid and think, it wasn't a bad job. And for years, you know, I always reckon that every hedge I did it better than the previous ones, because you're always learning. I've worked with different boys at it over the years, and you can always pick up wee tips and wee tricks about how to manage difficult, awkward stuff, and it's always worth listening and sort of watching, and you'll always learn something. Going to competitions and things like that, and watching the real masters is to me, maybe I'm a hedge laying anorak or what, I don't know, but it's a great day out, you know. I really enjoy it. So I came down to Tullycavey and did a hedge or two in the place I got there, my own, and the word sort of got out that that's what I did, and gradually I got asked to come and do bits and pieces here and there, and so it has sort of progressed from that. And to date I have probably laid hedges in nearly half the counties of Ireland. Haven't travelled so far this last lot of years, but still would, you know, occasionally. But no, it's a very satisfying job. Sometimes you can move into start a big rough hedge and you look at it and it's quite a daunting prospect, and you think, gosh, I'm never going to get this done. But once you get it 2 or 3 days over you and you look back and see what you've done, it starts to seem doable, and when you finally get it finished, it's very rewarding. There are lots of different tools for this job, and over the years I've accrued a fair sort of mix of bits and pieces of stuff. That is a wee axe that belonged to my father, and it is the nicest piece of steel I think I've ever seen. It's just an absolute joy to work with. A fella that I actually lay hedges with a bit put a new shaft in it for me. He made the shaft and put it in. One day I broke it and he took it away with him one evening and brought it back, and it's a make called the Elwell, and it's generally reckoned to be the business. They make the best of tools. The old tools are definitely the better tools for the job. The quality of the steel is far better. They keep a better edge and just easier and nicer to work with. Over the years I've watched different boys working with different tools and axes and bill hooks, and I would have started off actually working more with something like that, But I watched fellas in England working with these. This is what they call a Yorkshire hook, and I thought, boy, they make that look very easy. It's great, you know. I'll have to get one of those. So I got one, and I didn't like it. I just found it awkward and different, but I persevered with it, and I forced myself to use it. And I can honestly say now, if I had to pick any one tool to go and work at a hedge, that's the one I would take. It's the most versatile piece of kit that you could have. You can use it with one hand, you can use it with two hands, you have a good straight face there to almost use it like an axe. You can cut round corners with this part here, and it is definitely a great tool. But then there's other stuff. When you get into the big heavy hedges, then you do need an axe with punches a bit of a clout, a bit of weight behind it. So, you know, you could have all sorts of bits and pieces of stuff, and I do have quite a range of different things just that I've gathered up over the years here and there. But that, I would say, is the business. A wee saw like that is invaluable, and just to keep it on your hip there and have it to your hand when you need it is very, very useful. You get into wee awkward places. You then get into the like of the power tools, the chainsaws and the hedge cutters and stuff, which is a more modern way of doing it. But there is a place for them, particularly from the commercial point of view. You've times money, I suppose you say. And the chainsaw has definitely made working at hedges, you know, from a hedge laying point of view, it made it easier. I prefer, if I can, to just use the hand tools because I find it's more peaceful and quiet, relaxing. It's a bit harder work sometimes, but it's a nicer environment, you know. So I'm all for driving the stakes. It's a very rare piece of kit. They don't grow on trees, these things, you know. That's a piece of Irish yew, and it has served me well. I've probably had it for about 15 years, and it's still going strong. I think maybe by the time that's done, that'll be done, so I'll not need another one maybe. But you need something to drive the stakes in, and it's a far nicer thing to work with than a steel hammer or anything like that, because if it bounces off and hits you, it'll not hurt you the same way. So the other important thing are gloves, particularly working with hedge thorns, which most of the hedges will be working. That is half of a pair of a proper hedge laying mitt, which is pig leather, pig hide. The other hand, the left hand one, is actually fallen by the wayside nearly because I use it far more. You can't really operate the hand tools with these, but it's like trying to work with a boxing glove on. So the left hand one is well worn away, but that's the mate of it there, and you can see the thickness of the leather. Like there's not a whole lot gets through it. The danger with the other one is it's so worn that you think that you're safe and then you're not, because the thorns are getting through it. But that's a proper pair of hedge laying mitts. You obviously, using chainsaws and things like that, you can't work with something like that. So mostly what I would do is just keep a wee fine pair of gloves on underneath those, and then if you have to pull the glove off to use the hand tools, you've still got a wee bit of protection on your hand. But those are the basic tools that you would be using. The main reason for hedge laying is really to rejuvenate old hedges and put a bit of life and vigour back into them, make them more stock proof. And traditionally, years ago, before the days of sheep wire and barbed wire, this was your fence. And in fact, you'll hear boys talking about laying a fence or building a fence, and this is what they're talking about. There was no wire, so they had to make this as stock proof as possible. There are lots of different styles depending on what your stock is and what part of the country you're in. If you have only got sheep, you don't need a big high laid hedge. If you've got sheep, you need it all tight and low to the ground to keep them in. But it's more than just laying one stem and down on top of the other. You've got to take into consideration where the regrowth is coming, and you've got to protect that regrowth. Now, in the modern way of going, most hedge laying is done and then it's fenced for a year or two to keep stock off it from browsing the regrowth, which is sensible and important. So, but some of the styles are created in such a way that they actually allow the regrowth to maybe come up on one side of the hedge, and all the brush on the hedge will protect it from the stalk. And this would be a fairly good example here. In fact, if there was no hedge here, you have a tilled field here and a grass field here, you would actually lay your hedge back this way and allow the regrowth to come back on this side where you know there's not going to be any stalk for a year or two. So that allows it to get up and get strong and sort of look after itself. Well, there's a bit of blackthorn here. There's been a fair bit of ivy through it. It's important to clean out the hedge, both the ivy and any extraneous briars and bits and pieces, but it's also important to clean out the garbage on the ground as well and try and eliminate the ivy, because that'll creep back up through the hedge very, very quickly. I would have forced that a bit more, but for that sake of that there, so it's maybe just a wee bit high, but the main thing is the growth will come from here. Yeah. Hazel's probably the nicest timber you could work with for stakes and binders. It's not particularly plentiful in this part of the world, so you have to kind of make do with whatever you can get, but unfortunately I've managed to cut a lot of these hazel stakes for this job, so it is definitely the nicest timber. And the beauty about it is if you go into coppice a bit of hazel, you can get your stakes and your binders both in the one place very often, which saves a bit of walking about. The thing you have to remember is that for every yard of hedge laying you do, you need 2 stakes and 2 binders. Well, I always reckon on sort of 10% more. So if you have 100 yards of hedge to lay, I would like to think that it would be going with 220 stakes and 220 binders, just to be sure that you haven't run out. And that in itself takes quite a bit of time to source. You know, you could take a day nearly to get enough materials to do you for your week's work. You know, 20 yards of hedge laying in the day is reckoned to be a reasonably good day's work. The old boys years ago reckoned a chain a day, 22 yards would have been the sort of the given, but they weren't maybe doing a whole lot of other things before and after that in the day. So, you know, as you get your stakes, you want to point them, always point the heavy end, because if it's going to break off, it'll break off just like a fence post just above ground level, so you might as well have the heavy bit of the timber doing the work for you. And it doesn't need to be very fancy, but just a good point on it like that, and that's... Having said that, a good straight stake might be preferable, but occasionally a good bendy one can prove to be very useful as well, because sometimes you go to put a stake in and just where you want to put it, there's maybe a root or a big stone or a rabbit hole or something that just prevents you putting it where you want it. And what you can do with something like this is, once you have it pointed up, you maybe want the top of the stake here, but you can put it in 4 inches further over, and you can rotate it round a bit as well to find the sweet spot in the line of the stake line. So the odd bendy one is a useful thing to have as well. So these stakes don't really need to last particularly long. If you get 2 or 3 years out of them, it's to steady the hedge and support the thing, but once the regrowth coming up through the hedge grows up through it, they almost act like stakes themselves, so they don't really need to last long. And in fact, years ago I remember my father telling me that the gypsies would have come around and they would have pulled the stakes out, not this year's work or last year's work, but the older stuff, and it was a good dry source of firewood for them, but they weren't doing any harm then. They knew enough to know that they could afford to take that stuff out and they weren't doing anybody any harm. So 2-3 years, that's all they need to last. Roughly speaking, as I say, you want two sticks to the yard, so that is a good gauge of a measure. Some people would put their stakes in as they go, nearly put the stake in and lay the thorn down onto it, which is a good way, particularly in competitions where the judges are looking at the spacing and equal spacing and that sort of thing. It's not always very practical, but it is another way of doing it. Well, one of the last parts of the job is to bind the hedge, and the binding is not strictly speaking necessary, but it definitely enhances the job and makes the hedge a lot more imposing looking, particularly where you've got big livestock. Puts a kind of hard top on the hedge. To start off, you need three binders. Now, my way of binding a hedge is a little bit unconventional. Nobody ever taught me how to do it. I'm self-taught, so it's definitely different, but it works. You have them twisted together as one, bring it up, out over the back of that stake and back down in front, and then keep those separated out. And that's your first bit of binding done. Then you put your next binder in there where you have your single one that you started off with at the back of the stake, and again you twist, make those as one. You don't need to go right to the end. Up over the back of the stake, back down this front here, and already you can start to see it starting to take shape. So you take those two that were the original two and the next one, and again you make them as one, bearing in mind that each one will gradually peter out, so you really only have two decent binders in any one run. And up over the back and back down in. You always add a binder at every stake. If you try to miss one, if you think your binders are long, it'll not work. You just need to add one every time. But you can lay most native broadleaf stuff, you know, and it doesn't have to be confined to farm hedges, you know. Okay, well, we're just trim up the hedge now and tidy it up and leave it. This is my wee bonus here. This is my wee bit of firewood here. So
sheep.